Picture this. It's late evening somewhere in ancient southern Africa, around 80,000 years ago, and most of the group is gathered near the main fire after a long day. Near the edge of the group, slightly apart from the main cluster of adults, a woman is nursing her infant, a baby that is, by any objective measure of the ancient animal world, one of the most conspicuously vulnerable things currently existing within 100 miles in any direction. It makes noise at unpredictable intervals. It smells distinctly different from the adults around it. It moves erratically and can't regulate its own temperature, flee from anything, or defend itself against literally any threat whatsoever, up to and including a moderately determined house cat, if house cats had existed yet. Somewhere out in the darkness beyond the fire's reach, something large is moving. It pauses. It catches a scent. And then, after a moment of genuine calculation that would chill any modern parent to the bone, it continues moving in a completely different direction entirely. So here's the genuinely fascinating question this entire video exists to dig into. How did animals actually react to ancient human babies? Because ancient human infants were, by any realistic ecological measure, extraordinarily, almost provocatively vulnerable. They were loud, small, slow, helpless, and carried a scent profile completely distinct from the capable, weapon-wielding adults around them. So what stopped every opportunistic predator in ancient Africa, Eurasia, and eventually every other continent ancient humans spread into? From simply treating these tiny, helpless, noisy little things as easy, readily available prey? Stick around because the answer involves real predator psychology, some genuinely fascinating behavioral ecology, and a surprisingly layered story about exactly how ancient human groups managed to keep their most vulnerable members alive in a world that contained things specifically built to eat anything slow and small. Let's start with the most basic, most important ecological reality here, because it frames everything else we're about to discuss. Ancient human babies were genuinely, objectively vulnerable in ways that even other primate infants largely weren't. We've covered this extensively in our earlier video about how ancient human children actually survived, but it's worth restating directly here because it's the foundation the entire rest of this conversation builds on. Most primate infants can cling to their mother's body almost immediately after birth, gripping tightly with both hands and feet and moving with their mother without requiring her to actively carry them. A human baby cannot do this. Human infants are essentially unable to support their own weight, regulate their own body temperature, or produce any kind of meaningful defensive response to a threat for an extraordinarily long initial period compared to virtually any other primate species of comparable size. They can cry, which is both useful and genuinely dangerous depending on circumstance, and that's essentially the complete inventory of their active capabilities during the first months of life. From a predator's perspective, this should have made ancient human babies extraordinarily attractive targets. Small, immobile, conspicuous through both sound and scent, representing an easy caloric opportunity requiring virtually zero risk compared to pursuing capable adult prey. And yet the evidence clearly demonstrates that our species survived and spread successfully across genuinely predator-rich environments for hundreds of thousands of years, including during the period when infant birth rates would have needed to significantly exceed infant mortality rates for any net population growth to occur at all. Something was working to protect those babies, and understanding exactly what that something was tells us an enormous amount about both predator psychology and ancient human group behavior simultaneously. Let's talk about fire first, because this is the single most immediate, most powerful protective factor available to ancient human groups, specifically regarding their most vulnerable members. We covered fire's role as a predator deterrent extensively in our fire discovery video, and touched on it again in our thumbs video, but it deserves specific, focused attention in the context of infant protection here. A fire maintained through the night around a sleeping group represents an almost extraordinarily effective protective barrier against virtually every large terrestrial predator in any ancient human's environment, operating through a combination of deeply ingrained predator instinct around open flame and simple practical deterrence around the visibility and warmth that makes approaching the fire perimeter genuinely uncomfortable and psychologically aversive for most large carnivores. This means simply keeping fire burning through the night, something ancient human groups appear to have done consistently. Once reliable fire use was established, immediately reduced the infant predation risk from the full range of large nocturnal predators, which represent some of the most significant threats in virtually every ancient human environment, to a genuinely manageable level. Now let's talk about something genuinely fascinating regarding the specific acoustic signature of an ancient human infant crying, and how different categories of animals would have responded to it, because this is where things get considerably more complex and interesting than simple fire keeps predators away logic alone. Human infant crying is genuinely remarkable as a sound, distinct from most other animal vocalizations in ways that appear to trigger genuinely different responses in different categories of listeners. Researchers studying infant crying across various contexts have found that it functions as an extraordinarily effective distress signal, specifically calibrated through millions of years of primate evolution, to be both impossible to ignore and deeply motivating toward caregiving behavior in adult humans specifically. But what about non-human animals? The response varies enormously and in genuinely interesting ways depending on the animal, its relationship to ancient human groups, and its general ecological position relative to humans. Large predators encountering infant crying almost certainly processed it through a genuinely interesting dual filter. On one hand, small distressed animal sounds are generally associated with vulnerability and easy prey in most predator sensory experience. On the other hand, those same sounds, coming from within a human group camp, are also directly associated with the fully capable, weapon-carrying adults who would be immediately alerted and potentially mobilized by exactly that same sound. This creates a genuinely interesting predator psychology situation, where the very signal indicating vulnerability simultaneously advertises the presence of the group response that vulnerability would trigger. A predator approaching a crying infant in a human camp isn't approaching a lone, isolated, vulnerable target. It's approaching the sound that immediately, reliably wakes and mobilizes every capable adult in that camp simultaneously, which represents a genuinely different and considerably more dangerous proposition. Let's bring in something genuinely important regarding scent and olfactory predator behavior here, because this represents a dimension of ancient infant vulnerability that's easy to overlook from a modern human perspective, but would have been absolutely significant from the perspective of any scent-oriented predator in an ancient environment. Human infants have a genuinely distinctive scent profile, different from adult humans and different from other species, and this distinct scent would have been detectable to any reasonably competent mammalian predator from a meaningful distance, long before any visual or auditory signal reached them. Researchers studying predator hunting behavior have established that scent is often the primary initial detection method for many large mammalian predators, with visual and auditory confirmation typically occurring only after initial scent detection. This means an ancient human camp containing infants was essentially broadcasting a clear, distinctive olfactory signal across a fairly wide surrounding area, advertising the presence of genuinely vulnerable individuals to anything in the vicinity with adequate scenting capability. Ancient human groups likely addressed this challenge through multiple overlapping strategies, not always deliberately or consciously, but through accumulated behavioral patterns that reduced exposure effectively nonetheless. Fire itself generates strong, pervasive smoke that significantly masks other underlying scents, providing an unintentional but genuinely effective scent masking function alongside its more obvious visual deterrent value. Group camping patterns that kept the most vulnerable individuals, infants and young children, physically centered within the group's sleeping arrangement rather than positioned at the exposed perimeter, represented another naturally arising protective pattern that directly addressed vulnerability to scent-following predators approaching from outside the camp's fire perimeter. Let's address something genuinely fascinating regarding specific animal categories and their distinct responses to ancient human babies, because not all animals responded identically, and these differences tell us something genuinely interesting about how the presence of ancient human groups shaped behavioral responses across multiple species simultaneously. Large apex predators, the kind that would have represented the most serious direct threat to any ancient human infant, including cave lions, hyenas, leopards, and various other large carnivores, almost certainly maintained the kind of cautious, fire-respecting, group-avoiding behavioral patterns we discussed in our thumbs video. Patterns that extended their protective effect specifically over the most vulnerable group members simply by keeping large predators away from the entire group simultaneously. A large predator that had learned to treat the human group as a genuinely uncertain, potentially costly engagement didn't parse that assessment differently based on whether the camp currently contained infants. The group deterrence extended automatically across all of its members, regardless of individual vulnerability. Now let's talk about something genuinely interesting regarding medium-sized opportunistic predators, because this category, animals like jackals, smaller wildcats, various large corvids and raptors, and various other opportunistic scavengers and hunters represented a somewhat different kind of threat than apex predators specifically. These animals almost certainly did attempt opportunistic approaches toward human camps, particularly at night when fire maintenance might have been less consistent, seeking food scraps, small animals attracted to camp, or genuinely opportunistic targets. The response from these medium-sized opportunists to ancient human infant presence almost certainly varied considerably depending on specific circumstances. How close to a fire the infant was, whether adults were visibly awake and alert nearby, whether the camp's general noise and activity level suggested high or low overall vigilance at any given moment. These more opportunistic, less physically imposing animals were simultaneously more willing to approach closer than apex predators and less capable of overwhelming a group response if their approach triggered one, creating a specific intermediate threat profile that ancient human groups almost certainly developed specific practical behavioral adaptations to manage over generations of accumulated experience. Let's bring in something genuinely fascinating regarding dogs and their ancestors here too, because this connects directly back to our earlier video about how animals kept ancient humans alive, and it applies with particular relevance to infant protection specifically. We established in that earlier video that the developing relationship between ancient humans and proto-dog wolves likely began very early in the deep ancient era, and one of the genuinely most compelling practical benefits of that developing relationship, beyond hunting assistance and general early warning capability, would have been its specific, direct relevance to infant and small child protection. A dog or proto-dog living alongside an ancient human group, with its dramatically superior scenting capability, hearing range, and instinctive alertness to unfamiliar animal presence, would have functioned as an extraordinarily effective early warning system, specifically against exactly the kind of medium-sized, opportunistic, nocturnal approach threat that might have represented the highest probability infant predation risk in many ancient environments. This represents yet another dimension of the genuinely consequential ancient human-dog relationship that deserves specific recognition, not just as a hunting partnership, but as a directly relevant protective relationship extending specifically over the most vulnerable group members. Let's address something genuinely important regarding maternal behavior and its interaction with animal responses here too, because this connects to broader patterns of ancient child survival we discussed in our earlier video. Ancient mothers almost certainly developed highly sensitized responses to environmental threat signals, specifically when carrying or nursing infants, exactly the kind of heightened vigilance that modern research has documented in nursing mothers across multiple mammalian species, representing an evolved, hormonally influenced increase in threat detection sensitivity during the period of highest infant vulnerability. This heightened maternal vigilance would have contributed directly to infant survival by ensuring that any animal approach triggering concern, even before it developed into a genuine direct threat, received an immediate, alert response that both disrupted the approach and likely triggered group-level response from other nearby adults. Now let's talk about something genuinely interesting regarding the response of other non-predatory animals to ancient human babies specifically, because this represents a less obvious but genuinely fascinating dimension of this entire topic. Various large herbivores, elephants being perhaps the most dramatically documented modern example, showed genuinely strong, sometimes surprisingly protective behavioral responses toward infant animals of other species in distress, including human infants under certain circumstances, a pattern documented across various contexts in both anecdotal accounts and some more systematic behavioral observations. While the specific mechanisms underlying these responses remain somewhat debated among researchers, the broader pattern of certain large, socially complex herbivores showing something resembling cross-species infant distress response is genuinely documented and connects to interesting questions about exactly which animal cognitive and emotional capabilities enabled these kinds of cross-species responses. For ancient humans, Large herbivores like elephants, which were genuinely common across many ancient human environments, almost certainly represented a genuinely complex ecological relationship that went considerably beyond simple prey and predator dynamics. Elephants in particular have well-documented long memories, sophisticated social structures, and genuinely impressive cognitive capability, and ancient human groups sharing territory with elephant populations almost certainly developed nuanced, accumulated knowledge about elephant behavior patterns and how to predict and manage interactions with these extremely large, occasionally dangerous, but generally non-predatory animals. An ancient human group camping near water sources used by elephants had to manage this relationship carefully, and the presence of infants almost certainly factored into exactly how careful those management decisions actually were. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating regarding birds of prey specifically, because this represents a genuinely significant, often overlooked threat category for ancient human infants. Specifically, that's somewhat different from terrestrial predator threats. Large birds of prey, including various ancient eagle species and other large raptors, would have been entirely capable, in principle, of targeting a small, unguarded infant left exposed on the ground even briefly, and there's anecdotal evidence from various traditional cultures of exactly this kind of avian threat being taken seriously as a genuine, if not daily, concern regarding small children. The behavioral adaptations required to manage this kind of aerial threat are somewhat different from those addressing terrestrial predators. Since fire perimeters, group vigilance, and similar ground-level protective patterns provide less direct defense against aerial approach. Keeping infants physically covered, keeping them within confined, sheltered spaces whenever feasible, and ensuring at least some adult awareness was consistently directed toward aerial threats rather than purely ground-level approaches almost certainly represented genuine, accumulated behavioral adaptations that ancient groups developed in response to exactly this kind of aerial vulnerability. Let's bring in something genuinely important regarding the cumulative, multi-layered nature of all of these protective systems working together, because this is really the key insight tying this entire conversation together. No single protective factor, not fire alone, not group vigilance alone, not protodog early, warning alone, not sheltered sleeping arrangements alone, was sufficient on its own to fully address the entire range of animal threats facing ancient human infants across the full diversity of environments ancient humans actually inhabited. What actually kept ancient human babies safe across these genuinely dangerous environments was the overlapping, mutually reinforcing combination of multiple simultaneously operating protective factors, each addressing different specific threat categories and circumstances, combining into a genuinely robust, redundant protective system that no single failure point could completely overcome. This mirrors exactly the pattern we've documented repeatedly throughout this entire series regarding virtually every other aspect of ancient human survival: redundancy, layering, and cooperative contribution all working together to address a genuinely complex, multidimensional challenge that no single, simple solution could adequately handle alone. Let's address something genuinely important regarding how ancient infants' own behavioral capabilities contributed to this protective system, even though those capabilities were genuinely minimal compared to older children and adults. We've already established that human infants cry loudly and reliably when distressed, and while that crying represents a genuine vulnerability signal in certain contexts, it also functions as an extraordinarily reliable alarm system within the group itself, ensuring that any genuine threat actually approaching close enough to distress an infant immediately alerts every adult capable of responding. Some researchers studying infant development have proposed that the human infant's remarkable, almost compulsive ability to maintain close physical contact with caregivers through whatever means available to them, including crying, rooting, and various other attachment behaviors, represents an evolved adaptation specifically shaped by exactly the kind of predation pressure we've been discussing throughout this entire video, keeping the infant in close physical proximity to the protective capabilities of capable adults at all times when possible. Now let's circle back to something genuinely fascinating regarding exactly how this entire story eventually changed as ancient human groups became increasingly ecologically dominant, because this connects to the broader trajectory we've discussed across multiple videos in this series. We established in our thumbs video that ancient humans gradually transitioned from genuinely vulnerable prey animals to something large predators actively learned to avoid across many environments. As this transition occurred over thousands of generations, the specific predation pressure on the most vulnerable group members, including infants, would have gradually but meaningfully shifted as well, with certain categories of large predator threat declining in relevance as those predators increasingly retreated from areas of dense ancient human habitation. This wouldn't have eliminated infant vulnerability entirely, since opportunistic medium-sized predators, disease, accident, and countless other threats remained constant throughout, but it likely gradually reduced the specific acute large predator threat dimension of infant vulnerability across the deepest ancient era as ancient human technological and ecological capability progressively expanded. So how did animals react to ancient human babies? Based on the deeply rooted fire avoidance that extended the group's protective umbrella specifically over its most vulnerable members, the dual signal nature of infant crying that simultaneously advertised vulnerability and mobilized group response. The scent masking effect of smoke combined with sheltered central sleeping arrangements for the most vulnerable individuals, the specific, practical contribution of proto-dog early warning capability directed precisely at the medium-sized opportunistic predator threat, the heightened maternal vigilance during peak infant vulnerability, and the gradual but real shift in large predator behavior as ancient human ecological dominance expanded, the honest answer reveals something genuinely more sophisticated than simple predator avoidance. Ancient human groups didn't protect their infants through any single, reliable method. They protected them through an entire overlapping system of behavioral, technological, and eventually interspecies cooperative strategies, each addressing a different dimension of a genuinely complex, multi-directional threat environment, building together into a survival apparatus just robust enough to keep our species' most helpless members alive through one of the most ecologically dangerous periods in our entire evolutionary history. And maybe that's genuinely the most striking takeaway buried in this entire topic. Every single person alive today is the product of that protection holding, generation after generation, through tens of thousands of years of genuinely dangerous nights in genuinely dangerous environments, protected not by any single brilliant solution, but by the accumulated, overlapping, redundant care of an entire community, a developing interspecies partnership, a maintained fire, and the quiet, genuinely consequential decision of a predator in the darkness choosing, one more time, to simply walk the other way.